Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So last week I did a video about the new 5e D&D, specifically Ravenloft, and how these very specific group of female writers who are extremely progressive, quote unquote, in their way of dealing with writing are actually using the manual for Ravenloft to promote their progressive ideological agenda. And one of those writers for that 5e manual was K. Tempest Bradford. And when doing my minimal amount of research into this woman to see what she was all about when I was doing that video, I ran across an article that she had written about 10 years ago, 2014. And it's called Women Are Destroying Science Fiction! Exclamation mark. In brackets, that's okay, they created it. Now, as I said, while this article is almost 10 years old at this point, I think it's very good to go over it. Why? Because, well, number one, it gives you a good snapshot of the history of what we are struggling against right now with all of entertainment, wherein it is controlled almost completely by your progressive ideologues. But also, besides that, it's a good snapshot of where she was thinking that science fiction and fantasy and horror to some degree were going to go in the future, and we are now in that future. So it's good to take a step back and look at what they had planned all along and use that information to try and reclaim what she talks about here, which is science fiction, horror, and fantasy. And speaking of fantasy, I just want to let everyone know that there is a link in the description and in the pinned comment, if I remember, for my new graphic novel, Karam the Destroyer. It is a return to form for low fantasy. It is written not only in the vein of Robert E. Howard, but what I try to do is recreate the characters of Kull, Conan, Solomon Kane, by looking back towards the Irish mythology that he himself had read and used as inspiration, which I know fairly well since I grew up with it. The tagline for the book, which is very much in the vein of Irish mythology, is "When an undefeatable king meets an unstoppable force, a battle of will begins." You're looking at some of the beautiful art for that book and that campaign in the background, and if you want to know more about the story, I have an 11-page preview of it, all lettered, there on the Indiegogo campaign page, the book itself being 66 pages minimum. The campaign has been open for about 10 days now, and we've made over $10,000, which means we've smashed through our first 2 stretch goals. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. And if fantasy isn't for you, I also have a superhero graphic novel called The Valiant Heroes. I'll put the link for that in the description as well. So what I'm going to do is go over this article because it is fairly short. Again, analyze it according to the very metrics that it itself uses to see if it can prove its own points. And after that analysis, go into the very thing which it talks about, as in looking towards the future, again, which is now since this was written in 2014, and in the end talk about how we use this exact kind of layout that she herself gives to take back the territory of science fiction, fantasy, horror, etc. I'll put this article in the background so that you can see it as I talk. And as I said, the title for the article itself is Women Are Destroying Science Fiction! Exclamation point. In brackets, that's okay, they created it. Now, before I even get into the article itself, I always have to go over this very short little bit about how these quote-unquote progressive people write an article. They don't write an article in an academic sense. That is to say, they don't give their thesis up front. What they do is they usually use some emotional baggage or manipulation in order to get you to walk down a winding, twisting, emotional road wherein you agree with most of the turning points and then hit you with their thesis at the very end, which, since you're so used to nodding your head yes, you then agree with this fantastical thesis that they give at the end. Funny enough, what they do is they use it as a rhetorical argument, just like story is a rhetorical argument. And as the master craftsman of reason and logic, Aristotle, used to say, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds upon pre-existent knowledge. And rhetorical argumentation is a very unique subsection of this because that's exactly what it does. It takes some points which the presenter says, I already know that my audience agrees with these principles, therefore I'm going to start arguing from their agreement forward and don't have to go back to first principles. That's how rhetorical argumentation works. But again, the funny thing is that when these quote-unquote progressive people write an article, they do it in the style of a story more than an article, and when they write a story, they do it more in the style of an article, not a story. And what do I mean by this? Well, as I said, when they write an article, they're using emotional turning points, which is something you'd normally see in a story, a rhetorical argument that is a story. That's what you would see, how you would see character development. But no, they use that for argumentation in articles. And within stories itself, they take characters, which should be representations of human beings, and use them as simply the embodiment of ideas itself. As I'm always saying, their characters aren't characters at all. They're ideas in a mask. The mask is that they're portrayed as characters. They're not characters. They're just, again, embodiments of ideas. But that kind of structure in a rhetorical argument, that is to say, to present your ideas to your audience above all else, should be something that you would reserve for an article. So this article by K. Tempest Bradford doesn't, in itself, actually give you its thesis statement right at the very beginning, except for the title of the article itself, which again is Women Are Destroying Science Fiction. That's okay. They created it. But she begins by saying, this month, science fiction and fantasy magazine Lightspeed interrupted its normal publishing schedule to bring readers a special issue, Women Destroying Science Fiction. Edited and written entirely by women, this issue is one part of a long, ongoing conversation about what constitutes real science fiction. They put real in quotation marks, and whether women are inherently any good at writing it. It was conceived in part by Lightspeed assistant editor Christy Yant last year, funded by more than 2,000 backers on Kickstarter, and will be followed up by 2 other special issues, Women Destroying Fantasy and Women Destroying Horror. So, just one note here. If you go down to the bottom of the article, you'll notice that there is an editorial note where they say that the original article stated that they had on Kickstarter not just 2,000 backers, but 200,000 backers. Now, 2,000 backers is nothing to sneeze at for crowdfunding. I know I've had 4 different campaigns now, but it's nowhere near 200,000. And that might have been a typo, but that's one heck of a typo. Quite honestly, I think it was put in there, or possibly put in there, or left in there as a typo to give the original readers of this article when it first came out much more of a shot in the arm to go and check this thing out. She continues, in her opening editorial, Yant quotes a famous speech given by author Pat Murphy back in 1991. And this is the quote, a persistent rumbling that I have heard echoing through science fiction says, in essence, that women don't write science fiction. Put a little more rudely, this rumbling says, and there are quotes within the quotes, those damn women are ruining science fiction. They are doing it by writing stuff that isn't real science fiction, and they are writing soft science fiction and fantasy. All right, so right off the bat, this is what I was talking about. This is an emotional turning for this article. Because you see, first of all, she's quoting Pat Murphy. Now, she doesn't need to quote Pat Murphy verbatim, but she does quote Pat Murphy verbatim because Pat Murphy herself is giving a speech which is supposed to have an emotional knee-jerk, that is to say, to call women down in a way that women will fight against this and say, no, they're wrong. She could have just said, Pat Murphy said X, Y, and Z, which would have been a much more analytical way of looking at the problem, but no, she had to quote her directly, and even Pat Murphy's quote has quotation marks in it itself when she says, those damn women are ruining science fiction. That's in single quotes, which is to say, most probably no one ever said this to her. This is the general feel that she has, and also the words real for science fiction are put in quotation marks, single quotes, and soft science fiction are put in single quotation marks. So, as I said, this is a sophistical use of emotion to try to get across a point instead of actually being analytical. But the article continues. Murphy gave this speech over 20 years ago, and yet you can still hear the same rumbling today. The perception that the science fiction that women write isn't real, in quotation marks, isn't as pervasive as it was in the 1960s, but it's just as ridiculous. Why she says 1960s, I have no idea, since what she's quoting is from 1991. But she continues, if you need proof to back up that assertion, all you need to do is read this issue of Lightspeed magazine. It's more than just an extra large and particularly great issue of an already good magazine. It's a master class on all the ways in which women are writing and have written some of the best science fiction available. Many of the concepts these stories explore are what purists would expect from the science fiction label. In the story Cuts Both Ways, cyborg implants create perfect memory recall. The story, like Daughter, deals with what happens when humans have access to easy cloning. And the story, The Unfathomable Sisterhood of Ick, takes place in a future where augmenting and messing with brain chemistry is as common as taking vitamin supplements is now. However, the authors are less focused on technological changes and more on the relations between people, or between people and society, or changing cultural and gender roles. That's true across the issue. Alright, so let's analyze these last couple of paragraphs. What she's doing is she's making a statement that women can't write real science fiction, and then she's arguing against that. And then she gives her points in order to argue against that. And the article goes on from this point, assuming that she has already made that argument in these statements that women can write true science fiction. And she thinks that that argument has been made because she's using emotional argumentation. That is to say, she's already rigged the outcome of this entire set of paragraphs by giving that quote in an emotional way where there is a knee-jerk reaction on the part of especially women, but everyone who is reading the article, so that when she gives her counterpoints to this problem, the audience then completely agrees with her, not because she's actually making the argument, but because they have that knee-jerk reaction and want basically to have some kind of revenge back upon this idea that women can't write real science fiction. And that's not just my interpretation of things, because if we analyze what she has just said as first of all the problem and then the solution to that problem, we see that far be it from actually proving her point, she has just proven the point of the other side to be true. That is to say, she's just proven the point that women don't write real science fiction. First of all, she's giving this as her point in her article. Secondly, she is saying that what she is describing is true across this entire issue that she's talking about. And thirdly, she's saying that this entire issue that she is talking about is, quote, a master class on all the ways in which women are writing and have written some of the best science fiction available. So again, she's extending her argument to not only this entire magazine and everyone who worked on this magazine, but everyone who is a woman which has written science fiction today and in the past. So she's saying this is how women write science fiction and have done so. But her assertion is that they write science fiction in a way that focuses less on technological changes and more on relations between people or between people and society or changing culture and gender roles. Now, I'm sorry, but what you have just described is not science fiction. If the central point of your story is not the technological change, then it's not science fiction. It's either speculative fiction or suppositional fiction, which might have some science fiction elements around the corners, but if it's not the heart of the story, it's not within the genre of science fiction. And to prove this point, and to prove that it's not just my bias that is saying this, let's move on over to Wikipedia, which again is a left-leaning publication, and see what they say about speculative fiction. It says, the term speculative fiction has been used by some critics and writers dissatisfied with what they consider to be a limitation of science fiction, being the need for the story to hold to scientific principles. They argue that speculative fiction better defines an expanded, open, imaginative type of fiction than does genre fiction, and the categories of fantasy, mystery, horror, and science fiction. Harlan Ellison used the term to avoid being pigeonholed as a writer. Ellison, a frequent proponent of writers embracing more literary and modernist directions, broke out of genre conventions to push the boundaries of speculative fiction. And let's just for a second look at the hyperlink to modernist. It says, literary modernism or modernist literature originated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and is characterized by a self-conscious break with traditional ways of writing in both poetry and prose fiction writing. Modernism experimented with literary form and expression. So basically what it's saying is that these modernist writers don't like to be pigeonholed by the traditional genres, especially science fiction, and therefore they break out of the science fiction genre and write something which is called speculative fiction, even though it may have some earmarks of science fiction. Then it goes on to say, the term suppositional fiction is sometimes used as a subcategory designating fiction in which characters and stories are constrained by an internal consistent world, but not necessarily one defined by any particular genre. So, what's the point? Well, the point is that when this author, K. Tempest Bradford, says that this is not just her argument, this is the argument of all the women across this magazine as a representation of all science fiction written by women now and in the past, and what they do is concentrate less on technological changes and more on relations between people in society, or concentrating on changing cultural or gender roles. She's not describing science fiction. According to a left-leaning source, which has ideological tinges which agree with her, they're saying that, no, you see, you're breaking the genre mold, especially of science fiction, and what you're writing is speculative or suppositional fiction, because it's a subcategory where characters and stories are constrained by an internally consistent world, but not necessarily one defined by any particular genre. So again, she's literally proving the other side's point, that women, according to her and what she's arguing, can't actually write real science fiction. But again, as I said, she thinks she has proven her point through this use of emotional manipulation, because she continues on as if she has actually proved that point. And she says, beyond hard science fiction, there are a wide range of speculative explorations taking place in both the near future and far, on Earth, in space, and on alien world. One of the issue's standouts, a story called In the Image of Man, is a near-future dystopia light on technological advances, but just as anti-corporation as any cyberpunk classic. All right, so with this statement, she's just put the nails in the coffin of the fact that she's proving the other side right. Not only does she acknowledge that this is speculative fiction, not science fiction, by saying there are a wide range of speculative explorations, but she also makes a non sequitur, nonsensical argument. She's saying that one of the best stories within this compilation is anti-corporation. And even though it doesn't talk about science fiction, since cyberpunk, which is science fiction, is also anti-corporation, since these two things actually share this one accident, which is to say something that is not essential to what the story is about, then these two things are the same. That is a ridiculous statement. But again, this is her sophistry on display. She's saying cyberpunk is anti-corporation, and this story, which isn't technically science fiction, is also anti-corporation. Therefore, it makes it the same as cyberpunk, which is science fiction, which then makes this story science fiction, instead of just calling it speculative fiction, which is what it is. And she goes on to prove this point again by saying, on the other end of the spectrum is the story Love is the Plan and the Plan is Death, written from a truly alien perspective with no human in sight, something I don't see enough of in science fiction. There are stories that refuse to stay firmly within genre boundaries, mixing horror and science fiction, mystery and steampunk, even Jane Austen-style Regency sensibility and far future tech. So once again, she's saying, when she states that these stories don't stay within genre boundaries, that this is not science fiction. What she's trying to argue is that speculative fiction and suppositional fiction are indeed science fiction, when the whole reason that speculative and suppositional fiction came into existence was because they didn't want to be labeled science fiction. And then she goes on to say, the latter half of the magazine is given over to articles and interviews that continue the conversation begun in the fiction. Here again, the idea that women have been integral to the genre is reinforced, but there's also a big emphasis on the future and how women science fiction writers imagine it differently. Then she gives another quote from Pat Murphy, the woman she did the knee-jerk reaction quote from at the top of the article, saying, "The stories we read and the stories we tell shape who we are." And then she continues on as herself, saying, "They also shape the culture they're born into. Thus, if women keep writing the kind of science fiction they want to see more of, and keep calling it science fiction, the room for that kind of science fiction expands within the genre, not destroying, just displacing other kinds of science fiction. In brackets, the universe is ever expanding, close brackets, and existing more predominantly beside it." All right, so here we get to the actual meat on the bone of this article. First of all, you see, this magazine she's talking about, half of it is taken up by interviews and conversations which don't have anything to do with the fiction itself, except for they believe that those ideas were brought up in that fiction. And this, I would say, tips the hand of the entire thing. What these female authors want to do is not write science fiction, but talk about all the things that Kate Tempest Bradford talked about at the first of this article. They don't want to write science fiction. They don't want to concentrate on technological changes. They want to concentrate and talk about relationships between people in society, or changing cultural and gender roles. And the way that they get to talk about it is by writing stories which have some similarity to science fiction and using that science fiction to draw people in, and then doing a bait and switch because it's not actually science fiction, it's speculative or suppositional fiction that concentrates on the things that I just talked about with societal change and gender roles and all that kind of thing, and allows the audience to enter into that argument first through the story and then through the meat of what they want to say in the articles. You see how this is not science fiction? But the real kicker is at the end of this paragraph when she says, if women keep writing the kind of science fiction they want to see more of and keep calling it science fiction, the room for that kind of science fiction expands within the genre. So here we have her saying they need to redefine what science fiction itself is. She's saying, if women keep writing the kind of science fiction, quote unquote, that they want to write, which isn't science fiction, it's speculative or suppositional fiction, but they keep calling it science fiction, then it's actually going to become science fiction. But not just become science fiction, but do it in a very particular way. Because if women keep writing this quote-unquote science fiction and keep calling it science fiction, then this, in her words, expands its influence within the genre of science fiction itself and, I quote, not destroying, just displacing other kinds of science fiction and existing more prominently beside it. This is quite simply a statement of what these quote-unquote progressive people always do. She's saying, if we elbow our way into this genre by keep calling something which isn't science fiction, and we take over more and more room so that we displace some of the actual science fiction that's there, then it will become prominent within the genre of science fiction itself. We will gain control of the term science fiction, and then science fiction will only become what we have redefined it as, which is the female way of writing quote-unquote science fiction, which again isn't science fiction, it's speculative or suppositional fiction, which concentrates on things like gender roles, or the changing in society, or relationships between people or people and society. It might have some hints of science fiction around the edges, but it's not science fiction. They want to redefine the entire genre of science fiction by slowly taking the entire thing over. And again, this is not just me flying off the handle and attributing to them this kind of malice that has no actual place within what they're doing, because I did a video about 2 years ago now where I went to actual feminist journals, and what do they talk about? They talk about the exact same thing within the university setting, saying that feminism needs to act, in their words, not my words, like a virus. It needs to expand from its own academic setting of feminism and, in their words, infect the other faculties of learning and then colonize them by taking them over slowly but surely through the change in use of language until they are under the thrall of feminism itself. Again, these are feminist articles written by feminists in feminist journals saying this exact same thing. This is what Kate Tempest Bradford is saying right here about science fiction about 10 years ago. If you want a science fiction way of thinking about it, think about the Borg. They act like the Borg. They're a collectivist movement based upon an ideology which has its roots in collectivism, and they seek to infect, slowly but surely, everything that they touch, taking it over so that they become the dominant ideological strain of thinking, the dominant strain of thinking, period, within everything and anything they want to take over. And then Kate Tempest Bradford, seemingly triumphant in having, in her mind, actually proved her points, concludes by saying the following: if your notion of science fiction is confined to the vision brought forth by the likes of Asimov, Heinlein, Herbert, Sturgeon, and Clarke, all fine writers, mind, then the stories within these pages may well seem like destruction. As with such alarming developments as women sweeping the fiction categories of the Nebula Awards. Okay, I just have to stop right there because this is something I've talked about on my channel many, many times, especially when talking about Marvel Comics. You see how they try to prove a point by saying we have won all of these awards. What they're doing is using awards as the currency to try and prove the point that they're actually right. But I've talked to authors like John C. Wright, who was part of the Sad Puppies movement, which basically went to the Hugo Awards between 2013 and 2017, which was occurring just at the time she's writing this, and said, hey, look, you're not actually giving out awards based on merit anymore. You're giving them out based on political correctness. That's not how these awards are supposed to work, and they were shut down. Just for fun, and to talk to all the people who normally listen to me and understand what is going on within Comicsgate, let's look at the Wikipedia definition of the Sad Puppies movement. Very briefly, it says, Sad Puppies was an unsuccessful, right-wing, anti-diversity voting campaign run from 2013 to 2017 and intended to influence the outcome of the annual Hugo Awards, the longest-running prize since 1953 for science fiction or fantasy works. And a little further down it says, the Sad Puppy activists accuse the Hugo Awards of giving awards on the basis of political correctness and favoring authors and artists who aren't straight, white, and male. First off, does that sound familiar to anybody who's in Comicsgate? This was happening in 2013. You had these activists taking over the awards so that they were done within political correctness, not according to merit, and anyone who disagreed with them, and especially anyone who tried to contravene their taking over of these awards, was called a right-wing anti-diversity this or that. And the proof of this was given to me when I talked to John C. Wright, and he talked about the fact that you had these authors who had never written anything before getting these awards, when these awards traditionally had gone to people who had actual merit in the genre of science fiction and fantasy and could prove that merit through their track record. But again, they were starting to give these to basically unknown people. Why? Based upon their immutable characteristics, which goes back to nothing but identity politics. But again, you see, Kate Tempest Bradford here is saying, look, women are sweeping these awards. Obviously, that proves that we can actually write real science fiction and that it's real science fiction, when nothing could be farther from the truth. The truth is, you and your ideologues have taken over the award ceremonies and how they're given out to people so that you give them out only to yourself and people who support your ideology. Therefore, of course, they're going to pick you and the people who support your ideology. It's no real mystery in the entire thing, but they shroud it in the mystery of the historical and the history of these awards being for merit. But she continues on in that paragraph saying, and the way that speakers at feminist science fiction conventions characterize science fiction as an exploration of the future and myth and history, and call for more stories that include the voices, experiences, subjectivities, and realities of many. Now, 2 points I want to bring out of that. You see how this is not science fiction. What she's describing is something which is completely not only foreign, but opposite to science itself. If science fiction is concentrated on the science and the way that science actually plays out, and what she's talking about are stories that include and focus on the subjective realities of individuals, which is the exact opposite of how science itself works, then they're not writing science fiction. And the other thing that she says about exploring the future and myth and history. You see how these people want to not only colonize and take over in a Borg-like fashion the thing that already exists and then call it their own by redefining it, then they also want to redefine the history of the thing so that it makes it look like they were the ones always in control, and this is what it always was. This is what Kate Tempest Bradford herself is doing within this article. And this is one of the things that was expressed within that Writers Guild of America Zoom call that I covered a couple of months ago, where the actual title of the video put up by the Writers Guild of America was Queering Legacy Characters. They quite specifically talk about the fact that once they have ideological control and are moving forward with this, it's not enough. Then they got to go back and change the history. Then you got to start seeing things like queer cowboys as if they existed in actual history. But anyways, she finishes off by saying, so, are women destroying science fiction? Yes. Women created it, so it's only fair. First off, that's her statement, not mine. She says yes to this. That wasn't my yes, that was her yes within the article. But she says women created science fiction, so it's only fair that they can destroy it. She has never proved this point anywhere in this article at all. But she goes on within the next line to try to give some justification for it because she hasn't proved it by putting in brackets, most would cite Frankenstein's author Mary Shelley here, but others point out that Margaret Cavendish preceded her. This is her one-line explanation that women created science fiction. The fact that there is a science fiction author within history shows that she created science fiction somehow. Or what she wants to go back to is Margaret Cavendish, who wrote a utopian treatise, which she calls The Origins of Science Fiction. Even though it is called proto-science fiction, that idea is laughable. It's a utopian treatise. How in the world did she create science fiction if there were utopian treatises, at the very least, 100 years before her? She was writing, I think, in 1660. And you have Thomas More's Utopia, not to mention Plato's utopian description of Atlantis, Thomas More being in the 1500s, Plato being in the 4th century BC. But if it's not the utopian aspect, but the aspect of the utopia being on a different planet, which is what Margaret Cavendish's story does, well, again, I can go back to, at the very least, ancient Roman times, where there were authors who wrote faux travel journals talking about visiting the sun and the moon and other planets. So there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to suppose that the origin of science fiction is either Mary Shelley or Margaret Cavendish, except for her assertion here. And then Kate Tempest Bradford goes on with her finishing sentence to say, in destroying it, women are creating a larger space for themselves within science fiction, one filled with their voices, dreams, experiences, and realities. So again, the whole point of what she's trying to say is women are recreating the genre of science fiction, taking it over and expanding it, so-called, and introducing into it other realities, their own subjective realities, which is the exact opposite of what science fiction is supposed to be based upon, so that they redefine speculative and suppositional fiction as being science fiction. So the point is, again, when she states, "So are women destroying science fiction?" and her answer is yes, she's saying what women are actually destroying is actual science fiction, is what you would call hard science fiction. Science fiction as it has existed within history. Yes, they are destroying that. Why? Because in her way of thinking, it is females that created it. It is females that kept it alive. It is females that now control it. And in the future, which is what she's looking towards, it is females that will not only redefine it, but take over the entire thing and make it into something that it isn't. Make it into an ideological vehicle. And what she is doing here, according to my estimation, which is all that it is, my estimation, based upon what I know about the woman, what I know she has written, what I know she has been an activist for, what I know about her argumentation style, is that she's assuming the basic feminist principle that anything male is evil and anything female is good. Once again, see feminist literature and the difference between female empowerment versus male power. So, that is to say, when men control something, they're destructive, based upon a competitive ethic and things like merit. So men don't actually create anything according to feminist ideology. Only women can create anything, because women and their empowerment is cooperational and creative. This is one of the tenets of feminism. So she is using that as an underlying principle that she herself is so enthralled by, she doesn't even have to mention it within this article, but I think that is her underlying principle in stating that, yes, women created science fiction and fantasy without giving anything but a one-line descriptor of how that actually occurred, and that itself having no backing whatsoever. And I know this video is getting long, but really, what I want to do here at the end is look at the fact that she was saying all of this back in 2014, nearly 10 years ago. And it is her ideological bent that allows her to believe that what she's saying is true, not only in the past, because they've colonized not only the present at that time, but also the past, to go back and change that, but also the future. So in her mind, it is the fact that only women can be creative, only women created science fiction, women now control the science fiction, and since we are in control of it, we have redefined it in order to have it serve our ideological principles. Therefore, in the future, it will only be in service of us and our ideology. And you'll notice this idea, this quote-unquote progressive idea, that there can never be any movement in the opposite direction. Why? Because they assume that the people on the other side can't actually create because they don't have a progressive mentality, which, quite honestly, is the exact opposite of reality. And I must point out the weak point in their entire ideological struggle that they have engaged in within the last minimum 10 years of taking over entertainment. Because she gives the exact example of how to take this thing over. What she is doing is she's promoting this Kickstarter, which is an independent way of muscling into science fiction and fantasy, saying that we need to start small and elbow our way in there and take over more and more control until we dominate the space and then can redefine it. But what stops us from doing the exact same thing now? Well, in their mind, we can't do the exact same thing now because we, on the other side, can't be creative. But we know from the last 10 years of history that if you look at the entertainment and what these quote-unquote feminists and these female writers of science fiction and fantasy, etc., have done to these genres and these industries, they've done nothing but destroy them. And the only thing of merit left is the independent scene for science fiction and fantasy and horror in many of the outlets in which it can actually go out there to the people. Even back in 2016, when I ran across the self-publication novel industry, at that time, the self-published science fiction and fantasy was actually vying for control of the majority of the sales for science fiction and fantasy. But of course, these people, like K. Tempest Bradford, can't actually acknowledge that. Why? Because they're collectivists, and they're basing everything upon not only power, but power politics and cultural institutional ways of thinking. So they believe that if you're not institutional and in control of that institution through power, then you don't matter whatsoever. That's why you get things like people saying to young Ripa, who's made $4 million on one graphic novel, that, well, you're never going to make as much money as Marvel Comics, so we can ignore you. First of all, they're comparing apples and oranges, but the reason why they're doing it, they're saying the fact that since you don't have institutional control with what you're doing, you're irrelevant because everything's based upon power, institutional control. And again, that's their weak point. We can create, because contrary to what they think on the other side, creativity is not linked to docility. We can be independent, we can vote with our dollar, we can change the course of things like science fiction and fantasy as the actual science fiction and fantasy consumers, and they will write us off and ignore us and try to, using their words, marginalize us to the point that they will ignore everything that we're doing, even if we start to take back all of the territory that we have lost and start to institute merit-based systems, individual though they may be, upon things like the creation of entertainment based on the genres of science fiction and fantasy. Or, to put it in simplistic terms, by quoting, as I have in the past and will in the future, the words of Jean-Luc Picard when dealing with the Borg, they invade our space, and we fall back. They assimilate entire industries, and we fall back. Not again. The line must be drawn here. This far, no further. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the link is in the description and on the pinned comment for my fantasy graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer, a return to form for low fantasy. So click on that link in the description and order your copy of Crom the Destroyer today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.